Gary Hilton had always been a shadow in the woods, a man who blended seamlessly with the trees, hiding secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Sheriff Kern, with years of experience tracking down killers, knew something was off when Hilton vanished into the forest, but what he didn't know was that Hilton had been hunting far more than wildlife. Alongside him, Dr. Lena Farrow, a forensic psychologist, was about to dive into the twisted mind of a man who believed he was saving the very place where he murdered his victims. As they closed in on Hilton, they realized this wasn't just a search for a killer. It was a race to uncover the dark truth hiding in the heart of the forest. In the small, peaceful town of Red Pine County, nestled between dense forests and winding rivers, life had always moved slowly. People knew each other by name, and crime was a rare occurrence. But something dark was brewing in the heart of the woods, something no one was prepared for. It started with the disappearance of Lena Farrow, a local schoolteacher, on a seemingly ordinary weekend. Lena was an avid hiker and often spent her free time exploring the trails that ran deep into the surrounding wilderness. That Saturday, she set off alone, with nothing but a backpack filled with provisions and a map of the forest she had trekked countless times before. Lena was an experienced hiker, and her disappearance was entirely out of character. She was the kind of person who always told someone where she was going and when she planned to return, but this time, no one heard from her. When Lena failed to return by Sunday evening, her friends and family became worried. They knew she loved the outdoors, but also knew she had no reason to stray off the marked path. The following morning, her husband, Evan Veller, reported her missing, and a search party was quickly organized. Local volunteers, along with a few trained search and rescue teams, combed through the forest for days. They found her hiking boots, her map, and a few personal items scattered along one of the more rugged trails. But there was no sign of Lena. No blood, no struggle, just the eerie silence of the forest. As days turned into weeks, the search efforts grew more desperate. Flyers were posted around town and social media campaigns were launched, but the mysterious disappearance remained unsolved. In a small town like Red Pine County, the fear that something sinister might be at play began to settle in. But even with the fear, no one could have prepared for what would come next. Less than a month after Lena's disappearance, a second hiker vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Derek Lane, a retired Army veteran, had been hiking in the same area Lena had visited. Derek, in his late 50s, was a seasoned outdoorsman who had spent decades hiking all over the world. He had made it a habit to hike alone, enjoying the solitude of the wilderness. His disappearance, like Lena's, was baffling. Derek's wife, Maria Lane, reported him missing when he failed to return home after a weekend hike. Just as with Lena, Derek's personal belongings were found scattered along a trail near the forest's edge. A water bottle, a torn map, and a flashlight were the only signs of his presence. There were no footprints leading away from the site, no sign of a struggle, just the quiet whisper of the trees in the wind. Authorities initially believed Derek might have gotten lost or injured, but after searching for days, they found no trace of him. With each day that passed, the mystery deepened, and the fear in the town grew. The local sheriff, Miles Kern, who had lived in Red Pine County all his life, had never seen anything like this. The peaceful woods that surrounded the town were now the source of dread. What started as two missing hikers soon became a full-blown investigation. Sheriff Kern was no stranger to missing persons cases, but this was different. The lack of evidence, the eerie similarities between both disappearances, it all pointed to something far more sinister than simple accidents or bad luck. The sheriff had no clear leads to follow, but something about the way the victims vanished left him unsettled. It was as if they had just disappeared into thin air. The forest had always been known for its deep, dark corners and thick trees, but to think that something, or someone, was actively hunting people in such a place seemed too terrifying to comprehend. The idea that a predator was lurking so close to home was a thought Kern could barely entertain. The search for Derek Lane was called off after several weeks, and the case went cold, much to the horror of his wife Maria. It seemed as though the forest had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. But Nina's and Derek's disappearances weren't the end of it. They were just the beginning of something much darker. Local authorities began to receive reports from hikers who spoke of an unsettling encounter with a stranger. An old man appearing seemingly out of nowhere would offer help with directions or advice. His presence was always brief, but always unsettling. No one thought much of it at first. It was just a strange man, after all. But as the reports began to pile up, Sheriff Kern started to wonder if this mysterious figure could be connected to the disappearances. Something told him that the man was not just a passerby. The townspeople were unaware, but their worst fears were only just beginning to surface. The woods, once a peaceful retreat, had become a place where something far more dangerous lurked in the shadows. And then there was the discovery. Something that would change everything. Sheriff Miles Kern was not one to jump to conclusions, but as the weeks passed without any solid leads in the disappearances of Nina Veller and Derek Lane, a disturbing pattern began to form. There was something unsettling about the way the two hikers had vanished, both experienced outdoorsmen, both familiar with the trails, both last seen near the same stretch of dense woods. The local community, once sure that the disappearances were accidents or the result of natural causes, began to grow anxious. Whispers of foul play spread through town like wildfire. The breakthrough came when a local woman, Linda Rollins, reported an odd encounter with an elderly man she had met while hiking in the same area where Nina and Derek had disappeared. Linda was an amateur photographer who often visited the forest to take pictures of wildlife. One day, while on a secluded trail, she came across a frail, thin man with scruffy hair and a patchy beard. He was sitting on a fallen log, looking oddly out of place in the remote area. The man, whom Linda later described as being in his late 60s, gave off an unsettling aura. He claimed he was just passing through, but his demeanor didn't sit right with her. There was something about the way he spoke that seemed forced, almost rehearsed. The old man had been courteous but distant. He briefly offered to help Linda with her gear before quickly retreating into the woods. His behavior struck Linda as strange, but it wasn't until later that she realized just how dangerous her encounter might have been. The man had been in the same area where both Nina and Derek had gone missing. Her instincts told her that the man was more than just a harmless hiker, and she reported the incident to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Kern was not immediately convinced that the old man had anything to do with the disappearances, but he could not ignore the eerie coincidence. A few days later, a new lead emerged. A retired officer, Tom Williams, who had worked with the sheriff's department for decades, reached out with information that he had remembered from a previous investigation. Several years ago, there had been similar reports of a strange man, seen near hiking trails in the region. The officer described a person matching Linda's description, an old man who would appear out of nowhere, offering advice or assistance to hikers, only to vanish without a trace. Tom's recollection raised alarm bells for Sheriff Kern. The idea that the same man might be involved in multiple disappearances was too significant to ignore. The sheriff ordered a thorough search of the area, focusing on the trails where the hikers had vanished. This time, the search teams were specifically looking for any signs of human presence, footprints, discarded items, or even reports from those who might have encountered the mysterious man. As the investigation continued, the sheriff's office began receiving more reports of similar sightings. Witnesses described the same frail, disheveled man who would appear unexpectedly along popular hiking trails. The strange figure seemed to know the forest intimately, often guiding people to secluded spots and providing directions to areas few would dare venture. But when the hikers would later recount their experiences, there was always a sense of unease about the encounter. No one seemed to know his name, and no one ever saw him for long. In an effort to gain more insight into this odd figure, Sheriff Kern and his team began digging into local records. They found a name that had surfaced several times over the years, but had never been properly investigated. The name was Gary Hilton. At first, the sheriff could not recall any specific details about him, but a deeper look into the records revealed a troubling history. Gary Hilton had been a drifter, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to establish deep roots anywhere. His criminal record, while not extensive, contained disturbing entries, mostly for minor offenses like trespassing and public disturbances. However, what stood out was a pattern of strange behavior that often involved the woods and outdoor areas. Hilton had a habit of disappearing for months at a time, only to resurface in different locations, never explaining where he had been or what he had been doing. The more the sheriff learned about Gary Hilton, the more unsettling the connection between the mysterious man and the missing hikers seemed. It wasn't just the similar descriptions or the fact that he had been seen in the same areas. It was the eerie certainty that Hilton had been lurking near the edges of the disappearances, like a shadow in the background. His knowledge of the wilderness, combined with his strange presence near both Nina's and Derek's last known locations, led Sheriff Kern to one inescapable conclusion. Gary Hilton was likely not just a witness or an observer. He was somehow involved. The breakthrough came when a witness, Jeremy Collins, a young man who had been hiking near the same area 2 days before Derek's disappearance, came forward with a crucial piece of information. Jeremy reported seeing an old man standing near the edge of a trail, watching him intently. The man had approached Jeremy briefly, but had quickly retreated when Jeremy asked if he needed help. What stuck in Jeremy's mind, however, was the intense stare of the old man, as though he had been waiting for something. It was a look of calculated patience, one that made Jeremy feel as though he were being studied. With this new lead, Sheriff Kern knew the investigation had to intensify. The forest that had once been a place of peace and beauty was now a hunting ground, and it was clear that someone knew it better than anyone else. The mystery of the vanishing hikers was deepening, and the only way to uncover the truth was to focus on the man who had been lurking just beneath the surface of it all, Gary Hilton. The breakthrough came when a local hunter, Earl Maddox, discovered something in the woods that would forever change the course of the investigation. It was early one morning, just as the sun began to rise over the horizon, when Earl stumbled upon a clearing deep within the forest. Earl had been hunting in this area for years, and while he had seen many things over the years, nothing had ever disturbed him as much as what he found that day. It started when he noticed an odd shape in the distance, half hidden by underbrush. At first, Earl thought it was just an animal carcass or the remnants of an old campfire. But as he drew closer, he realized that it was something much darker. The remains were not of an animal, but of something human. Partially buried in the dirt, a small pile of personal belongings lay scattered around a shallow grave. There were pieces of clothing, a pair of boots, a backpack, and what appeared to be a torn map. Most chilling of all, there were small, delicate items, things that belonged to someone who had once been there, someone who had been trying to escape. The scene was eerily familiar to the reports of missing hikers, but there was no body. Just the unsettling evidence of someone who had vanished, seemingly without a trace. Earl, knowing the severity of what he had found, immediately contacted the authorities. Within hours, Sheriff Kern and his team arrived at the site, combing through the area for any additional clues. They found more items scattered across the clearing, a broken compass, an old photograph, and even a water bottle with a faint trace of lipstick on it. It didn't take long for the investigators to confirm that these items belonged to Nina Veller, the first missing hiker. Her husband, Evan, identified a locket that Nina always wore, and it was then that the enormity of what they had discovered truly sank in. They were standing on the edge of something far darker than anyone had realized. The idea that Nina's disappearance had not been an accident, but rather part of a calculated scheme, started to feel all too real. Someone had been hunting people in the woods, and they had gotten away with it. As investigators scoured the clearing for any signs of a struggle, one detail stood out. The ground around the area was strangely disturbed. The dirt had been dug up and replaced with new soil, making it look as though someone had deliberately tried to conceal something. It was as if the person responsible had known exactly what they were doing, erasing their tracks just enough to avoid detection. Sheriff Kern's stomach tightened as he pieced everything together. This wasn't just the work of an opportunistic killer. This was the work of someone who had been planning this for some time, someone who had an intimate knowledge of the land and its hidden secrets. The next part of the investigation took a darker turn. When forensic teams arrived to collect the evidence, they found something even more chilling: a bloodstain, faint but unmistakable, near the edges of the clearing. It was not enough to identify the victim, but it was clear that it came from someone who had been severely injured. Sheriff Kern ordered an extensive search of the surrounding area, hoping to find the body of Lena Farrow or, at the very least, more concrete evidence. But despite their best efforts, they found nothing else. The blood trail stopped abruptly, as if the person had been moved or dragged away. By now, Sheriff Kern was convinced that this was not an isolated incident. The discovery of Nina's belongings, combined with the bloodstain, confirmed his worst fears. The disappearances were connected, and they were being orchestrated by someone who knew exactly how to evade detection. The woods, once seen as a place of tranquility, had become a trap, and whoever was behind these killings had learned how to use the forest to their advantage. With this new information in hand, the investigation shifted focus. The team scoured through records of anyone who might have spent time in the area. They cross-referenced missing persons reports and found that two other hikers, Derek Lane and Jeremy Collins, had also disappeared in the vicinity. What was even more disturbing was that all three hikers had been in the same general area just weeks apart, the same trails, the same locations. It was clear that the killer was familiar with the forest's layout, choosing spots where he could easily conceal the bodies or mislead search efforts. The key piece of evidence, however, was the leather-bound notebook that had been found hidden underneath a loose floorboard in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. When forensic experts opened the notebook, they found chilling entries that detailed the movements of the missing hikers. Each page was filled with descriptions of the victims, where they went, what they wore, how they acted. But it was the final words on each page that were the most disturbing. One with the forest. Over and over again, the phrase appeared. It was as though the killer believed that he was offering the victims a form of transcendence, a twisted homage to the wilderness that had consumed them. Sheriff Kern knew that they had to act fast. They had a name, Gary Hilton, and now they had a trail of evidence that seemed to lead directly to him. But the more they uncovered, the more questions emerged. Who was Gary Hilton really? What was his connection to the forest? And how had he managed to evade detection for so long? As the investigation moved forward, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But every answer only seemed to raise more questions, and the true extent of Gary Hilton's depravity was still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. After weeks of digging into Gary Hilton's past, the sheriff's department finally caught a break. It was a routine check of a small, rundown gas station just outside of Red Pine County when they finally apprehended Hilton. The station, located miles away from the main roads and hidden from most of the local population, had been a place Hilton frequented in the past. It was late in the evening, and the station was quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. The cashier on duty, Melanie Turner, had recognized Hilton as soon as he stepped inside to buy a can of beans and a few bottles of water. His scruffy appearance and uneasy demeanor had made him stand out among the usual customers. Melanie had seen him before, many years ago, but never paid much attention to him. However, tonight, there was something different about Hilton. He had grown more disheveled and gaunt over time. His skin was pale and his eyes were wide, as if he were sleep-deprived or constantly on edge. When he attempted to pay with cash, Melanie noticed his hands tremble slightly as he fumbled with his wallet. Something about his nervousness sent an alarm through her, and she made the decision to quietly call the sheriff's department. Within moments, officers had surrounded the gas station. As they approached Hilton, he turned and fled into the nearby woods, vanishing into the darkness. A brief pursuit followed, but Hilton's knowledge of the terrain gave him an advantage. He knew the forest like the back of his hand, and the officers soon realized that chasing him through the woods at night would be a fruitless effort. However, they knew Hilton couldn't escape forever, and they set up a perimeter, waiting for the morning light to make their next move. The next morning, after a tense and sleepless night, Hilton was found hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The discovery of the cabin was almost anticlimactic. It was a place few people ever visited, nestled in an area of the forest where trails and paths rarely ventured. Hilton had been living there for weeks, it seemed, with nothing but a small campfire and a few meager belongings scattered around. He was arrested without resistance, his face betraying nothing but a tired resignation. It was then that Sheriff Kern, along with forensic psychologist Dr. Lena Farrow, decided to conduct an interview with Hilton. They were hoping to unravel the man's motives and, perhaps more importantly, to discover where he had hidden the bodies of the missing hikers. The interview took place in a dimly lit room at the local police station, where Hilton sat across from Dr. Farrow and Sheriff Kern. The moment Hilton sat down, he seemed almost detached from the world around him, as if the reality of the situation hadn't fully sunk in. His eyes were blank, and his posture was slouched, almost as though he were waiting for something to happen. Dr. Farrow began the interview with simple questions, trying to gauge Hilton's mental state. She asked about his life before the killings, his past, his relationships, but Hilton gave no direct answers. Instead, he spoke in cryptic phrases, often staring off into space as if lost in his own thoughts. His responses were unsettling. When asked why he had done it, Hilton spoke of the forest as though it were a living entity, something to be revered, something sacred. He claimed that the hikers had disrespected the land by intruding on it, and that he had been chosen to cleanse them. He spoke about how he believed he had become one with the forest, how he had learned to blend into the shadows, becoming part of the landscape, watching people come and go without ever being noticed. Hilton had convinced himself that his actions were justified, that he was saving the forest from invaders. It was chilling to hear Hilton speak in such a calm, almost spiritual tone about something as horrific as murder. He didn't show remorse, didn't seem to regret his actions at all. In fact, he seemed almost proud of what he had done, as if he had been performing some twisted duty. When Dr. Farrow asked if he felt any guilt for the lives he had taken, Hilton's response was disarming. He simply said, "The forest needs what it needs. I was just its hands." As the interview progressed, it became clear that Hilton had no intention of providing specific details about his victims or the locations where they were buried. He spoke in riddles, offering vague clues and cryptic descriptions, but nothing concrete. Dr. Farrow tried to press him for answers, but Hilton only smiled faintly, almost as if he were enjoying the game. It was a sickening display of control, as though he knew that the authorities would be chasing shadows for as long as he desired. At one point, he leaned forward and whispered something that sent a shiver down Sheriff Kern's spine. "They're still out there," he said. "All of them? The ones I didn't get to?" His eyes flickered with a twisted sense of satisfaction, as if he had revealed some dark secret that no one else could comprehend. Dr. Farrow's hands clenched into fists under the table, but she kept her composure. Hilton's cryptic hints only deepened the mystery. The notion that there were more victims, more bodies hidden somewhere in the vast expanse of the forest, was a haunting possibility. Hilton had already claimed several lives, but his final words suggested that there were others, perhaps lost and forgotten, victims of his twisted view of the world. Despite Hilton's unwillingness to give specific answers, the authorities knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't afford to waste time deciphering the killer's mind games. As soon as the interview ended, Sheriff Kern made it clear that they would be scouring the entire forest, every trail, every hidden clearing, until every possible victim was accounted for. The real work was only just beginning, but with Hilton's cryptic warning still hanging in the air, the search for the missing hikers had taken on an even darker, more desperate tone. The forest, once a place of refuge, had become a graveyard, and Hilton had been its keeper. The days following Gary Hilton's arrest were tense and filled with a sense of urgency. Sheriff Kern, along with his team, launched an extensive search of the forest, covering every inch of terrain in hopes of finding the bodies Hilton had buried or hidden. The cryptic statements he made during the interview only fueled their determination. Hilton's claim that there were more victims out there, victims he hadn't gotten to, sent chills through the investigators. It was as though the forest itself had become a place of endless nightmares, with Hilton as its twisted guide. With Hilton's knowledge of the land, finding the hidden bodies was not an easy task. The search teams worked tirelessly, scouring remote parts of the forest, hoping to uncover any sign of the missing hikers. They used dogs to sniff for scents, ground-penetrating radar to detect any disturbances in the soil, and aerial drones to search from above. Despite their efforts, days passed without any real breakthrough. The forest, dense and impenetrable, seemed to swallow up every trace, every sign. It was as if Hilton had anticipated their every move, concealing his actions so well that even the most advanced techniques could not unearth the truth. Meanwhile, Sheriff Kern had Hilton moved to a maximum security facility, hoping that a change in environment might force the killer to reveal more information. Dr. Lena Farrow, who had spent countless hours interviewing Hilton, believed that with the right approach, they could break through his cryptic wall. But Hilton remained elusive. His demeanor was the same as it had been during the initial interview, calm, almost detached, as though he were watching the events unfold from a distance. Then, a breakthrough came unexpectedly. It wasn't from Hilton himself, but from a fellow inmate at the facility where he was being held. Edward Eddie Rowan, a man with a violent past who had been locked up for a series of armed robberies, approached Sheriff Kern with a startling piece of information. Eddie had been placed in the same cell block as Hilton and had watched him closely, intrigued by the strange man's behavior. It was clear to Eddie that Hilton was no ordinary prisoner. He spoke in riddles and often muttered to himself, as if carrying on conversations with someone who wasn't there. One night, as Hilton sat on his cot in the corner of the cell, he started talking about the forest again. Eddie, ever the opportunist, listened carefully, trying to make sense of Hilton's ramblings. To Eddie's surprise, Hilton suddenly mentioned something that made his ears perk up. "There's a place, deep in the woods, the perfect place." The words were barely above a whisper, but they were enough to make Eddie curious. Hilton spoke, as though he were recalling a memory, but one that held a sense of reverence, even longing. Eddie immediately alerted the guards, who informed Sheriff Kern of the conversation. The sheriff, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress, saw this as a potential breakthrough. He arranged for a second interview with Hilton, with Dr. Farrow's help, hoping to glean more information. When Hilton was brought into the interrogation room, his eyes were distant, almost absent, as if he had already checked out of the reality of the situation. However, when Dr. Farrow began to speak to him, asking about the perfect place he had mentioned, a flicker of recognition crossed Hilton's face. He didn't respond immediately, but there was a noticeable shift in his posture. It was as though he was considering whether or not to share the secret that he had kept hidden for so long. For hours, Hilton remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. But eventually, he spoke again. His words were slow and deliberate, each one weighed down with a sense of finality. "You don't understand," he said. "The forest is more than just trees and dirt. It's a place of transformation, a place where people change." Sheriff Kern and Dr. Farrow exchanged a glance, both unsure of what Hilton meant. It was clear that the man's mind had been warped by his twisted belief system, but there was still a sense of purpose behind his words. Hilton wasn't just a random killer. He was someone who saw himself as a part of something larger, something ancient, something that demanded sacrifice. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they still didn't know where the bodies were hidden. In a final, desperate attempt to uncover the truth, Sheriff Kern made the decision to bring Hilton back into the forest. He hoped that by confronting him with the place where he had carried out his twisted, ritualistic killings, Hilton would finally reveal the location of the victims' bodies. But the search would not be easy. Hilton, even in custody, had an uncanny ability to disappear into the wilderness, and the sheriff's team was not sure they could trust anything he said. With the search teams ready to move in, Hilton was escorted to the woods in a heavily secured convoy. As they arrived at a clearing near the edge of the forest, Hilton's behavior began to change. For the first time in days, he appeared to be genuinely engaged in the surroundings. His eyes darted around as though he were tracking something in the distance, a strange, satisfied smile creeping onto his lips. He led them to a part of the forest that was completely unfamiliar to the search teams, a location hidden behind thick foliage and an overgrowth of ivy. It was here, in this isolated clearing, that Hilton finally stopped. "There," he said, pointing to the ground. His voice was almost reverent, as if he had found the place where he truly belonged. The search teams immediately began to dig, and within hours, they unearthed the bodies of Nina Veller, Derek Lane, and 2 other unidentified victims. As the bodies were uncovered, the full horror of Hilton's crimes became clear. Each of the victims had been carefully arranged, their clothing torn and their bodies marked with strange symbols that Hilton had carved into their skin. The twisted rituals, the reverence he had spoken of, were all part of a sickening pattern that linked the victims to his belief system, his warped sense of justice for the forest. Gary Hilton was taken back into custody, his role as the mastermind behind the killings now undeniable. But even in the face of his capture, his expression remained unchanged. He had no remorse, no guilt. Hilton had never seen himself as a killer. In his mind, he had been a protector, a guardian of the forest. To him, the lives he had taken had been nothing more than sacrifices to an ancient power, and he had fulfilled his duty. The case was closed, but the horror lingered in the hearts of those who had been involved. The mystery of the perfect place had been solved, but Hilton's twisted perspective left an indelible mark on the forest, a place now forever tainted by his crimes.